So section 1.4, we're going to be talking about adding and subtracting real numbers. And so first thing we're going to do is just look at the two kind of more simple cases for adding real numbers. And so what I mean by the two simple cases is if they have the same sign, it's a little bit more straightforward. So if we have a positive number plus a positive number, so it's something like 2 and 3, add them together, we still end up with a positive number. And if we have a negative number plus another negative number, so something like -2 plus -3, because we're taking that -2 and we're making it more negative by adding another negative to it, we still end up with another negative number. We would get -5. So we're just going to add the numbers, keep the negative. All right, so our first set of examples, we're just going to go through and try a few of those. So number 1, if we have two positives, 1 plus 4, we just get a positive number 5. Number 2, if we have -2 plus -5, and we'll put that in parentheses just so we don't have a plus and what looks like a minus sign right next to each other. We're taking -2, making it more negative by 5, and so we get -7. Again, adding the numbers, keep the negative. Number 3, we have -7 plus -3, two negatives, so we add the numbers, keep the negative, so -10. And it works exactly the same for fractions. So number 4, let's say we have -2/5 plus -1/2. Couple things to keep in mind here. We're adding two negatives, so we're going to end up with a negative. And we're working with fractions, so we want to change our denominators to the common denominator, which in this case for 2 and 5 is going to be 10. So I'm going to change both of these to 10s, and I'm going to keep those negatives out in front so we don't lose them. This 5 has to be multiplied by 2, so 2 times 2 is 4, -4/10. This 2 has to be multiplied by 5, so 1 times 5 is 5, so -5/10. You can always double check your fraction changes here, your equivalent fractions, by just reducing this back down, make sure you get what you started with. Always a good thing to check as you're going through so you don't have to go back and double check all your work at the very end. And now we have two negatives, so we end up with a negative, and 4/10 plus 5/10 is 9/10. So same rules, we just have a negative in there. And finally, if we work with decimals, so say we have -1.27 plus -5.46. Can always do this addition off to the side, just so you can still get in that practice without a calculator. I'm just going to leave the negative off. Just make sure when you're adding decimals that the decimals line up, and if you have a missing space, fill in a 0. But if we go ahead and add these together, we get 6.73. But again, negative and a negative add together to give us another negative. All right, so the one that's a little bit trickier is when you're adding a positive and a negative. And so if you add a positive and a negative, this is going to depend on the sign of the larger number, or the absolute value of the larger number. And we have to say absolute value because technically the larger number is always going to be the positive one, but we want, the larger absolute value. Which one's further away from 0? So some examples of this. Number 1, so we have 6 plus -3. This pen likes to create random lines sometimes. All right, there we go. So what we're gonna do, we're thinking of this as we're taking 6 and we're making it more negative by 3. So if we look at this first one on a number line, we start at 6 and we make it more negative by 3, we end up at +3. And so what we did here was we subtracted the numbers. So even though we ended up with a 3, which is just what we happen to have here, 6 minus 3 gives us 3, and it's positive because this larger number is positive. So we're going to subtract and then take the sign of the, I'll put this in quotations, the larger number, whichever one has the larger absolute value. So let's take a look at another one. If we have -5 plus 1, first thing I'm going to do is figure out the sign. The 5 is larger, has a larger absolute value, so it's going to be negative. If I subtract these, we end up with 4, so -4. And if we think about that, if we had -5 on a number line, we're making it more positive by 1, so we go to the right one and we get -4. All right, so let's try some more of these. Number 3, we have -8 plus 2. Again, it's going to be negative because of this -8. And 8 minus 2 is 6, so -6. -15 plus 4. And I'll go ahead and actually write down a couple of these just so you can try them before I write down the answers. Number 5 is 17 plus -10. So figure out what sign they are, subtract the numbers, see what our answer is. So number 4, larger number is 15, so negative. 15 minus 4 is 11, so -11. 17 and 10, the larger one is 17, so it's positive, and if I subtract those, I get 7. And then let's go ahead and try 2 more of these with some fractions and decimals. So number 6, 3/4 plus -1 and 3/8. So if you notice for this one, right now we can see that this -1 is the larger number because it has a whole number out in front. This one's just less than 1, so it's going to be negative. But in order to add these, we want to get a change this to an improper fraction and get a common denominator. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So keep the 3/4, keep this negative, but then we want to multiply 8 times 1, which is 8, plus 3, so 11/8. Still need a common denominator, so we'll change this, the denominators to an 8, and so this first one's the only one that has to change. We have to multiply that by 2, so 2 times 3 is 6. And keep the -11/8. And even if we have a common denominator like this and it's an improper fraction, we can still tell that this first one is the larger number just by looking at the numerators since the denominators are the same. So it's going to be a negative. And just like we did with whole numbers, we're still going to subtract. So 11 minus 6 is 5, so we get -5/8. All right, and final one here, this one just so we can see it with some decimals. -9.5 plus 3.8. The larger number here is negative, so it'll be negative. And we need to subtract these two numbers. So I'm going to take 9.5 minus 3.8. Always make sure the bigger number is on top when you're subtracting. So we'll have to borrow here. 15 minus 8 is 7, and 8 minus 3 is 5. So we get negative 5.7. All right, and I lied, there's one last example. This one's just one of the special cases, 37 plus negative 37. Neither one of these is bigger, so it's not going to be positive or negative. And if we subtracted those, we would get 0. And so it's just going to make a lot of work a lot faster if we have opposites, because opposites always add to 0. All right, so now let's go ahead and do some kind of order of operations questions with real numbers. So number 1, we're given 2 plus bracket 7 plus negative 3 end bracket. And so remember, for these order of operations, we'll do everything inside of the grouping symbols first. So we're going to add 7 and negative 3. And so keep everything else the same. I'll put the 2 plus bracket. We may or may not need the bracket depending on what number we get. 7 is larger, so it'll be positive. And if we subtract those, we get 4. So we don't actually need the bracket here. If it were a negative number, we should keep it just so it looks a little bit nicer. But then 2 plus 4, 2 positives gives us 6. All right, let's go ahead and try a couple more of these. Let's do negative 9 plus bracket negative 4 plus parentheses negative 8 plus 6 and parentheses and brackets. So now we want to work from the inside out. So keep everything else the same. I'll bring over the negative 9 plus bracket negative 4 plus, I'm going to keep the parentheses for now. Negative 8 plus 6, they're opposite signs, so keep the sign of the larger number, which is negative. Subtract them and we get 2, and parentheses and brackets. This one is a negative, so we do want to keep those parentheses, just keep this looking nice. Next, we want to simplify inside these brackets. So I'll bring over the negative 9 plus, keep the bracket just in case. Negative 4 and negative 2, they're the same sign, so we're just going to add and keep the negative. So negative 6. And another negative plus a negative is going to give us a negative 15. So it's all about just breaking these down into their little parts. All right, last example in this set. The absolute value of negative 8 plus negative 10 in parentheses, and the absolute value plus the absolute value of 7 plus negative 7 absolute value. So we have two different groups here. They're both absolute value, so we'll go ahead and simplify them both at the same time. We could do this in 2 different steps. Simplifying one isn't going to affect the other, because we're just going to add them at the end. So if we look at this first one, remember, simplify inside first, so we're still going to have absolute value. Negative 8 and negative 10 gives us negative 18, plus absolute value 7 plus negative 7, they're opposites, so that gives us 0. Now we need to evaluate the absolute value before we can add. So negative 18 is 18 units from 0, so 18 plus the absolute value of 0, still 0. And 18 plus 0 is 18. All right, so now our next set of examples is similar to what we've been doing before. We want to go from sentences or phrases to mathematical statements. So examples, write a numerical expression just fancy words for write this out with numbers and symbols. Write a numerical expression for each phrase and then simplify. All right, so number 1, we're given 4 more than 12. Sorry, 4 more than negative 12. And so for this one, this is not greater than, or 4 is greater than, it's 4 more than. So if I said 4 more than 6, that means the number 10, we just added 4. So we're going to take negative 12 and add 4. This is our numerical expression. And then in order to simplify this, we're just going to add those two. So they're opposite signs. So we're going to subtract them, keep the sign of the larger number. So subtracting them, we get 8. And the larger number is negative 12. So negative 8. All right, number 2. The sum, remember sum means addition, of 6 and negative 7. So again, sum is addition, so we're going to have 6 plus negative 7. I'll put that in parentheses. Sums you can switch around, so if we would have done negative 7 plus 6, that's perfectly fine. And if we go ahead and simplify this, they're opposites again, so we'll subtract and we get 1. And the larger number is negative 7, so it's a negative 1. And our final example here, number 3, 7 increased by the sum of 8 and negative 3. All right, so this one's a little bit longer. We'll just break it down. So remember the sum of, whenever you see this, the sum of, the difference of, you always want to group those with parentheses. So I like just putting them into the actual sentence there. And let's go ahead and write that part down first. So the sum of 8 and negative 3 means we're adding. So 8 plus negative 3. Double parentheses here. If you wanted to use brackets instead, you can. I like to change them up as much as possible just so we don't get kind of mixed up with our symbols, or grouping symbols. And then we're increasing 7 by this amount. Increasing something, we're adding to it. So we're going to have 7 and we're adding this sum. And now simplifying this, we want to go ahead and just simplify inside those brackets first. Bring over the 7 plus, and 8 plus negative 3 opposites, so we subtract, take the sign of the larger number, which is positive, so we get positive 5, and 7 plus 5 is 12. All right, so those are just usually a little bit trickier, trying to figure out what they're actually saying, how to translate it into a numerical expression. Once you have that part down, shouldn't be too bad actually simplifying it. All right, now let's look at subtracting real numbers, and this is going to be just like adding with one extra step, kind of like how dividing fractions is multiplying with one extra step. So subtraction, a couple of notes here, is the same thing as finding the difference or finding how far apart two numbers are. And subtraction, we can also think of as adding the opposite. All right, so if we're adding the opposite, let's see what that means. Let's go ahead and look at a couple of examples. Actually really fast, let me write this out. We have A minus B. This is the same thing as taking A and adding the opposite of B. So adding negative B. And this right here with the addition is something we were just doing. So if you can add numbers, you should be able to take it, change it to addition, and then go ahead and add them together. All right, so just a few examples here. Number 1, we have 6 minus 10. Sometimes by looking at these, it's not too bad to tell what this is. We're taking 6, we're making it smaller by 10. I'm going to change it to addition, adding the opposite. So we're going to have 6 plus the opposite of 10. And if you have a plus and a minus, these together just make a minus. So if you remember the opposite of a negative, so if we had a negative and a negative, they make a positive. You shouldn't have that if you just started with one negative. So it should always be a plus followed by a minus. And we'll see some more of those in a second. But now this is what we saw before. So positive and a negative, take the sign of the larger number, which is negative, subtract, and we get 4. And if we think about looking at this on a number line, visualizing it, if you're a visual learner, taking 6 and moving 10 to the left on a number line, we would end up at -4. All right, number 2, we have -2 minus 4. We're only ever changing the sign associated with the number right after the minus sign. So this -2 is just going to stay in the front. And then we're going to add the opposite of 4. So add -4. And think of this as taking -2 and making it smaller by 4, which is what we're doing when we add -4. 2 negatives add to a negative, and we get -6. Number 3, 3 minus -5. And so this is one you've probably seen before, where if you have these 2 negatives, you can think of them as just canceling out and becoming a plus sign. The way to think about this, as we've just been doing them, is adding the opposite. We're going to take 3 and add, so this minus sign changes to addition, the opposite of -5, which is +5. And we get 8. Let's try another one. -8 minus -12. Again, we can just use our trick here and we can add the opposite. And so -8 plus 12, you don't have to rewrite that if you don't want to. But now we have opposite numbers, opposite signs, and so we take the sign of the larger number, positive, and then subtract, and we get 4. And just like we did with our other section, let's go ahead and look at an example with fractions and decimals. So this first one, we have 5/4 minus -3/7. So I'm going to go ahead and change this sign first. Doesn't matter if you want to change it to a common denominator first. I just like getting rid of the ugly kind of double negative first thing. So I'm going to change this to adding the opposite. So we have 5/4 plus 3/7. Change it to a common denominator. So 7 and 4, smallest number they go into is 28. Change both of those to a 28. And then 4 goes into 28 7 times. So 7 times 5 is 35. 7 goes into 28 4 times. 4 times 3 is 12. And then we'll add those and we get 47 over 28. And 47 is prime. There's no way to reduce this down. If you want to change this back to a mixed number, go ahead. I like to just leave it like this. If it doesn't specify, just kind of saves a little bit of time. All right, and then our last one here, we have 7.5 minus 9.2. And so for this one, we have, we're just subtracting a positive number here. So I'm going to change it to adding the opposite. So 7.5 plus the opposite of 9.2. And now we have opposite numbers here. So we want to go ahead and subtract. So we'll take 9.2 minus 7.5. Borrow there, get 7 and a 1. So 1.7, and the larger number is negative. So negative 1.7. All right, so now let's go ahead and try just a few of these with order of operations. So number one, we're given 2 minus bracket parentheses negative 3 in parentheses minus parentheses 4 plus 6 and parentheses and brackets. So a lot of different grouping symbols going on here. We do want to start on the inside and work our way out. This set of parentheses here isn't really doing anything. It's just kind of holding that negative 3 so it doesn't kind of get bombarded by the other negatives around it. That's fine, we don't really need it. But let's go ahead and simplify this group first. 4 plus 6, and I will bring over every single other term that we had. So 2 minus bracket negative 3. I'm just going to drop the parentheses there. Minus 4 plus 6 is 10. And now we want to simplify this group here. So again, I'll bring over the 2 and the minus. And I'm going to keep the brackets because we are going to end up with another negative. Negative 3 plus 10. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch that to adding the opposite just right here. So we're going to change it to adding the opposite. And so we have a negative 10 there now. So we have negative 3 plus negative 10. And I added parentheses around the negative 10 to make it look a little bit nicer. And now, negative 3 plus negative 10, same sign. And they're both negative, same sign, so we're adding and we end up with another negative. So I'm going to go ahead and bring over the 2, the minus, keep the brackets, and we get negative 13. And now brackets just act just like parentheses, so we can go ahead and add the opposite, and we have 2 plus 13, which gives us 15. All right, so a lot of simplifying going on in these. They tend to be a little bit longer, but breaking it down into little parts makes it a lot easier. So next one, we have bracket, parenthesis, 5 minus 7, end parenthesis, plus 3, bracket, minus 8. So again, working from the inside out, 5 minus 7, we want to go ahead and add the opposite. So I'm just going to change this one here again so that I don't have to rewrite this entire thing. So I'm going to add the opposite. And now 5 plus negative 7, we'll keep our bracket there. 5 plus negative 7, they're opposites. 7 is bigger, so we get negative 2 plus 3 and the bracket minus 8. Keep all that the same. And now we want to simplify inside the brackets. So 2 and 3, opposite signs again, so we subtract, we get 1. The 3 is larger, so it's positive. We don't need brackets around a positive 1, so now we subtract the 8. And now subtraction again, we want to add the opposite. So I'm going to use this one again and just add the opposite. Opposite signs, so we subtract and we get 7. And the 8 is larger, so we get negative 7. All right, so let's go ahead and try one more of these. Let's try this with absolute value. So we have 3, absolute value 6 minus 9, minus absolute value 4 minus 12. So big thing here is, again, simplifying inside the absolute value first before you start changing any signs. This 3 out in front just means we're multiplying it. So I'm going to simplify both of these at the same time just because we're working inside groups. So we can simplify those at the same time without affecting anything. So I'll leave the 3 out in front. And in this first absolute value, 6 minus 9, we're going to add the opposite. And we're going to have to do the same thing on the other one. So I'll add that in now, add the opposite. And now 6 plus negative 9, opposite sign, so we subtract and we get 3. And it's the 9 is bigger, so negative 3. Minus the absolute value of 4 plus negative 12. Opposite signs, the 12 is larger, so negative, and subtract and we get 8. And now it looks really messy with all these negatives and absolute values, but you just want to make sure that you simplify those absolute values all the way down before we start multiplying and subtracting. So I'll leave the 3 out in front. The absolute value of negative 3 is 3, and this 3 is just going to be multiplied by that. So I'll use parentheses for that one. Minus the absolute value of negative 8 is positive 8. And now it's just a matter of multiplying followed by subtracting. So 3 times 3 is 9, minus 8 is going to give us 1. So just really breaking it down into those individual steps. All right, now these next 2 sets of examples, these last 2 sets of examples, look a little bit longer just because they're going to take a little bit of writing. So I apologize that they're going to take a little bit of time to write out. But they're a little bit more, they're word problems. So this first one is what we saw before. We want to write a numerical expression and then simplify. Number 1, have the difference of negative 5 and negative 12. And so difference means subtraction. And whenever you see the word difference, you're just going to go in the order that you see them. We're not subtracting something from something else, so we don't have to worry about flipping it around. But we're taking the difference of negative 5 and negative 12. So we're going to have negative 5 minus negative 12, keeping all those negatives. And then simplifying this, we're going to add the opposite. So I'll rewrite this one just because it's kind of messy. We have negative 5 plus 12. Remember that negative 5 keeps its negative. Opposite signs, so it's a positive here, and subtract and we get 7. All right, number 2, we have negative 2 subtracted from, so this is that one where we're going to have to flip around the order, the sum of 4 and negative 4. So again, we have the sum of 4 and negative 4. I'm just going to throw in parentheses because those are grouped together. So I'll write that first and then figure out where everything else goes. So the sum of 4 and negative 4 means we're adding. So 4 plus, I'll change this to a bracket so we can put parentheses around that negative 4. And then we're subtracting negative 2 from this. So we're going to subtract negative 2, being really careful with that negative and subtraction sign. All right, so now let's go ahead and simplify. So 4 plus negative 4, simplifying inside the grouping symbols first. These are opposites, so we just get 0 minus negative 2. And I'm going to change that to add the opposite. And so this is 0 plus 2, which is just 2. All right, and then one more here before we do our final application problem. 9, comma, decreased by 10 less than 7. This one's probably the trickiest one. They don't really give us our grouping like they do in these up here where they say the sum of or the difference of. So we're taking 9, decreasing it by, that means we're subtracting something from it, and we're decreasing it by 10 less than 7. So if you break this down, say this in a way, in a certain way, it's kind of hard to tell, but we're decreasing it by 10 less than 7. So we're decreasing it by this group here. So I'm going to put parentheses there, and we're decreasing it by 10 less than 7. 10 less than 7 means we're subtracting 10 from 7, so 7 minus 10. And once we have that done, we can go ahead and start simplifying. So simplifying the group, keep the 9 minus 7 minus 10. We can go ahead and add the opposite. 7 plus negative 10 is now going to give us a negative 3. So we subtract and take the larger sign. And then again, we want to add the opposite. And 9 plus 3 is going to give us 12. All right, so now one final example. This one's just going to take a second to write out. So you can just skip right on through me writing this one out. This one's more of an application-based problem. So we're talking about elevations. The highest elevation in Argentina is 6,960 meters above sea level. The lowest is 40 meters below sea level. Find the difference between the two elevations. All right, so this one sounds a little bit trickier than it is, but what we're doing here is we are given that the highest elevation is 6,960 meters above sea level, so that's going to be positive. The lowest elevation is 40 meters below sea level, so this is negative. So we have a positive 6,960 meters, and we have a negative 40 meters. And to find the difference means subtraction. So we're just going to go ahead and subtract these two. And so 6,960 minus negative 40, we can go ahead and add the opposite. And so we have 6,960 plus 40, which is going to give us 7,000 meters. If you're more of a visual learner, I like seeing it this way a little bit more. It's just a little bit more work. Think of this as 6,960 meters above sea level. This is 0, and this is 40 meters below. And so the difference between these two is how far apart these numbers are. So we have a difference of 6,960 here, a distance of 40 here, and so to find the total, we're going to add those, which is what we ended up doing over here in our calculation. This is just a different way of thinking about it. All right, so then next we're going to get into multiplying and dividing real numbers in section 1.6.